With all the theories surrounding the JFK assassination 50 years later, there's one that stands out from the rest. It's called The Man Who Killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ, and is written by Nixon's presidential advisor, Roger Stone. Now, if you've never heard of Roger Stone, you're in for a treat. Not only did he serve under Nixon, Reagan, and Bush Sr., but he's also a self-proclaimed GOP hitman. That's not a phrase to use dirty tricks to get his way politically. Well, he joined me earlier to talk about his new book and his role in perpetuating dog and pony politics. I first asked him what the strongest piece of evidence is that implicates LBJ in Kennedy's murder.
Probably the fingerprint of a hitman named Malcolm Mac Wallace that is found on a cardboard box on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. It's the only print other than the prints of Lee Harvey Oswald that I believe were planted there. So that is probably your strongest piece of evidence. Secondarily, Johnson's mistress of 21 years, Madeline Duncan Brown, who bore him an illegitimate son, said that Lyndon Johnson told her on the eve of the assassination, after tomorrow I won't have to deal with those Kennedy SOBs no more. And then lastly, I think, when the presidential motorcade pulled into Dealey Plaza in Dallas, when Vice President Johnson's car made the 120-degree turn into Dealey Plaza, Lyndon Johnson, before the first shot has been fired, is on the floor in his car. He hits the deck. There's photographic evidence that proves this. So I would say both before, during, and after the assassination, Lyndon Johnson's actions betray the fact that he is, in fact, the man yoking a conspiracy, or in this case, a plot that includes the CIA, organized crime, and big oil, Texas oil.
A lot of people have written books alleging that LBJ was behind the assassination. What makes your book different?
I have a lot of firsthand information, meaning I had the opportunity to spend a substantial amount of time with President Richard Nixon to ask him about his views of the Kennedy assassination. He was, of course, in Dallas. He is recorded on the White House tapes, the Watergate tapes, as saying the Warren Commission was the greatest hoax ever perpetrated. He told me directly, Lyndon Johnson and I both wanted to be president. The difference was I wasn't willing to kill for it. Additionally, I have confirmations from Ambassador John Davis Lodge, who was the brother of Henry Cabot Lodge, JFK's ambassador to Vietnam, Attorney General John Mitchell, Tony Salerno, the head of the Genovese crime family here in New York, told me directly that it was Carlos Marcello working with the CIA and Lyndon Johnson who killed JFK. So I have a lot of firsthand information in my book. I think it's very important to note that in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Lyndon Johnson tried to create the false impression that the Russian government had killed Kennedy. He told Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, who was reluctant to chair the Warren Commission. He was only persuaded because Johnson convinced him the Russians had killed Kennedy, and if the truth got out, it would precipitate World War III. This was a lie that Johnson told over and over. There was no truth to it. We now know that when Kennedy was killed, Nikita Khrushchev wept. Fidel Castro, who was with an American when he got the news, kept repeating over and over again, this is very bad news. This is very bad news. No, I don't think that the Russian state was involved in any way in the assassination. I think Johnson lied about this.
Roger, I want to move on to your own career in politics. You've called yourself, in your own words, a GOP hitman. What does that term mean, and why do you use the title to describe yourself?
Well, it was meant kind of euphemistically at the time, but look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I am a hard-bitten political realist. I have been on 8 national American presidential campaigns. I started with Richard Nixon in 1968. I worked for Ronald Reagan. I worked for George H.W. Bush. I worked on the recount in Florida for George W. Bush. I think I'm very realistic about American politics.
You did everything in your power to make sure the opponent didn't win. During your time serving under Nixon, you engaged in such activities as hiring spies to work on opposition campaigns, making fake donations to opposition candidates in the name of communist organizations, and spying on radical groups. Why did you find it necessary to engage in such dirty tricks?
Well, those activities of call in 1972 were all perfectly legal. It is only in the post-Watergate reforms they became illegal. I was 19 years old. There was a culture around Nixon of, if you won't do this, we'll find somebody that will. As I have written, I found a number of the things that they asked me to do, that they ordered me to do, puerile, juvenile, not particularly effective in terms of winning votes. Almost 30 years later, I found out that most of these missions I was sent out on were dreamed up by White House speechwriter Pat Buchanan. So again, those are perfectly legal activities, and I admit they don't match, say, Robert Kennedy, who has 1 million pieces of virulently anti-Catholic literature printed and mails it to every Catholic household in West Virginia, putting Hubert Humphrey's campaign address on it to make it look like it came from Humphrey. Politics ain't beanbag. It is a contact sport in the United States.
Well, being such a staunch advocate of Nixon, I know that you have that back piece, the tattoo of his face on your back. His approach to presidency largely in part because you said he rejected elitism. However, Roger, how can you see that reasoning to defend a president who clearly saw himself above the law?
I don't defend him. I think that he was brought down by his own hand. I think that he was both very great and very flawed. This is a man who could open the door to China. This is a man who could negotiate an arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union. This is a man who could desegregate the public schools in the United States, who passed affirmative action, who passed the first environmental protection legislation. So in many ways, very great. He was also brought down by his own paranoia. There was no reason to wiretap the Watergate. He was leading his opponent by 20 votes, but there was, I think, on the basis of his narrow loss in the 1960 election, which I believe was stolen from him by Lyndon Johnson, by the Democratic machine in Illinois. I think it bred in him a certain paranoia, and in the end, he was brought down by his own hand. So I'm not oblivious to his flaws. I admire him not for his political tactics as much as I admire him for his personal resilience. This is someone who gets knocked down and defeated and comes back. He says in 1962, when he ran for governor of California and lost, "Gentlemen, this is my last press conference. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." And only 6 years later, he is raising his hand to be sworn in as President of the United States.
You mentioned some liberal things that he kind of implemented. I mean, we're talking about the EPA, overseeing the integration in public schools, affirmative action policies. Do you think that Nixon could win a Republican primary today?
Absolutely not. I think that he would be appalled at the state of today's Republican Party. Nixon understood that to win elections, you needed to have the conservatives. You couldn't win without the conservatives, but you could not win with just the conservative, that politics is about addition and not subtraction. So he saw the disaster of 1964 and the nomination of Barry Goldwater, in which moderates were encouraged to leave and were offended, and he understood that you had to reach beyond them. Only 4 years later, he built a winning coalition. I don't think he could be nominated in today's Republican Party. I don't think Ronald Reagan could be nominated in today's Republican Party. I think social dogma has become too important a piece of the Republican cosmos. And I think that we are going to limit ourselves as a party if we keep becoming more and more and more exclusionary.
Let's move on to your role in the controversial 2000 presidential election. You mentioned earlier, kind of in a boastful way, that you were a major force in stopping the recount of ballots in Miami-Dade County. Why were you so desperately trying to subvert the democratic process? And is this really something to be proud of?
Well, first of all, I reject your characterization that I was subverting the Democratic caucus. We were going for the third recount of the same ballots. They had already been recounted twice without any change. The Democrats in Miami-Dade County wanted to recount them a third time. This was an obvious attempt to create new votes, to try to divine what voters were doing. It was a violation, I think, of the process. Now, I do think that if Al Gore had asked for a recount in every one of Florida's counties, he might well have become president. Instead, he asked for recounts in selective counties where he thought that he could pick up votes. So I would argue that that we ensured that there was not an abuse of the process. I was involved in the Brooks Brothers riot, absolutely, because two Democratic officials were attempting to take a sheaf of absentee ballots into a room with no windows and no doors and no neutral observers, no reporters, no Republicans, no neutral observers, and therefore that violates Florida's sunshine law, which prohibits that. So yes, I have no regrets about the specific role I played. I was not a supporter of the war in Iraq. It is one of the great, I think, mistakes of the Bush administration, of that Bush administration. So from that point of view, I may have a tinge of regret, but it wasn't about the tactics. It was about the fact that once he became president, I disagreed with a number of the policies of George W. Bush.
And so you agreed with the Supreme Court deciding that presidential election?
It was a political decision, but this is politics. And I think at the end of the day, we'll never really know. I reject the argument that all these voters were spoiled because of the use of the butterfly ballot, and that some voters inadvertently voted for Pat Buchanan when they meant to vote for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. The butterfly ballot that's being criticized has been in use by the Chicago Democratic machine for 20 years prior to that. So there was nothing wrong with that ballot. It's very simple. There's an arrow and a hole. If you're too stupid to know how to vote with simple instructions, then perhaps you're too dumb to vote. But no, I don't think there was anything fraudulent about that election.
All right.
I think it was very, very close.
Yeah, I guess 500,000 votes is not that close to me. You seem to be a huge fan of political theater, or what you call political performance art. Why do you think that this is a healthy way to approach politics in this country, and how can we ever expect real progress if people like you treat politics like a game when so many people are suffering?
Because politics is about being interesting, because if you turn on the television at night with the advent of cable, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of channels, and therefore when you add network TV on top of cable, on top of the internet, on top of magazines covering every subject imaginable, it's very hard to get enough repetition and to stand out. So I'm interested in making politics interesting, in making politics entertaining. Politics is show business for ugly people. Politics is about being interesting and therefore standing out and drawing public attention to your message. There's nothing illicit about it. It is a street theater, as it were, for the purpose of gaining attention to communicate a message. Go ahead, put out a white paper on your environmental positions. You will bore both the media and the voters to death, and no one will pay attention.
Well, I certainly agree. It is Hollywood for ugly people. Roger Stone, thanks so much for coming on. Author, former Nixon advisor, really appreciate your time.
Glad to be here.